All right, folks. So now we are going to do a very fun thing and take everything that you've done so far in this course and flip it. Because what we've been looking at so far has been something called the product market. So this is the market for goods and services. What we're going to be looking at now is the factor market, and that's the market for the factors of production. And as just sort of an intro to that, here is a graphic that if you take macro is going to be something that you're going to have to understand and study a bit more. For us in this, I just wanted to use it to illustrate the differences between the product market and the factor market. So, in any sort of situation, in any basic situation that we're going to be talking about, we have had two parties. We have had households and we have had firms. In product markets, households purchase goods and services in the product market in exchange for money. So if you look at the top portion of this graphic, you see the flow of money going one way from households into the market for goods and services and out into the firms. So firms then have the money. What do firms have that they provide, that they supply into the market for goods and services? Well, that would be the goods and services. So they supply the goods and services into the market, which then go to the households in that direction. If we're now looking on the opposite portion of this, we're now looking at the bottom of the circular flow diagram. We now see that everything has flipped because firms now have the money, households don't. Firms are putting the money into the market for factors of production, which then gives it to households. Households are the ones who hold the factors of production, supply them into the market for factors of production, and then they get sold to the firms. So what you're seeing here is a flip of how we've been looking at everything. So before, firms were supplying and households were demanding. In factor markets, it's the opposite. Households supply, firms demand. So to formalize that a bit, product market, household demands. Factor markets, factors of production means that households supply labor. We're normally going to be looking at labor markets, but it's really all factors of production. We're using labor as sort of the base case in this situation. They supply the labor to the firms that demand it. The price in this case is going to be the wage. So price, the y-axis is the wage. Quantity is still quantity of labor, usually in labor hours or something in that manner. And once again, I can't stress this enough. This is an inversion of everything we've been thinking of. So what we had been applying to supply, we're now going to apply to demand. And what we had been applying to demand, we now apply to supply. So we're going to see how that fits in as we progress. So first, a reminder of what the factors of production are that are going to be in this market. Labor, land includes natural resources. Capital, this is tools, machinery, human capital, all that stuff. Not money. Remember, money is not capital in economics. Entrepreneurship, and those are the four factors of production. Now, once again, you can't really model entrepreneurship. It's too difficult. It's too individualized. So instead, land, labor, and capital are going to be what's exchanged in these markets. So what we are going to be doing is we are going to focus on labor, but it applies to land and capital as well. Now, first, when we talk about factors of production and we talk about factor prices, these prices, these wages paid to the factors of production, they are going to determine which producers get which resources. And something to remember is that demand for a factor of production is known as derived demand, which is a fancy term to just say that demand for a good or service helps determine the demand for the factors that it uses, which makes a whole lot of sense. If demand for hamburgers goes up, then demand for the things that make hamburgers goes up. It just makes sense. It's simple cause and effect there. So you see it all the time. Demand increases for airline worker, for air travel. Therefore, demand for airline workers increases. This all should make sense on a pretty basic level. Um, so don't get too caught up in trying to think about the models and all of that when it comes to derived demand. Demand for product increases, demand for factors that produce that product increases as well. It's that simple. Now, when we're trying to determine factor demand, we now have to look at the productivity. Remember, productivity used to be looked at on the supply curve in product markets. Once again, we're flipped now, we're in factor markets. So, productivity, we're thinking about demand. So, when we're thinking about demand, we have to remember marginal product, or MP, is the additional output produced as the result of hiring one more worker, one more factor of production. We are now no longer thinking of marginal in terms of adding one more unit of output. We're looking at marginal in terms of one more unit of labor. So it's an important distinction there. So adding one more unit of labor is the marginal product of labor, MP sub L. You'll frequently see it that way. If it's the marginal productivity of capital, frequently you'll see it as MP sub K, K for capital, because MPC stands for something else. A lot of times you'll see it as sub K. Normally they will still let you know what it means off the bat before just jumping into the MP sub whatever letter they want to use. Now there is one important thing to remember when we're talking about demand for labor, and it's the idea of diminishing marginal product. So this is the idea that as you add more of a variable input, that variable input has to share the same amount of fixed input. That's because you can't change fixed input in the short run. So since you can't change fixed input in the short run, that variable input has to share the same amount of fixed input that was already there. So each new worker you have is going to be marginally less productive. Now, this will set in eventually. It doesn't necessarily always start that way, and that's due to specialization. So imagine one person doing every job in a factory. One person's doing every job. Adding that second person will make them specialize a little bit more, and they'll be more productive overall. And that can happen for a bit of labor, but eventually you're going to get to a point where hiring more people will cause them to be less marginally productive. Now, this doesn't mean less totally productive. That should still increase, but it will increase at a decreasing rate. It's the same exact idea as diminishing marginal utility, but now diminishing marginal product. So this frequently shows up as a chart, and it will show you the addition of workers and how productive they are marginally. And it will say, when does diminishing marginal product set in, or diminishing marginal returns? It'll be phrased something like that. And it's just whenever the marginal product starts decreasing as you add more workers. Sometimes they'll also show you the total product, and you have to find out the marginal product from that. That's just a simple subtraction as you go from one unit of labor to the next. Now, the marginal product is important to remember. However, it's important to realize that that's not all you need. You actually need to figure out, well, what's the value to the firm to hire that labor? Well, that depends on two things. It depends on the marginal product of that labor and the value of the product, how much they can sell the product for. So that is the value of the marginal product. I know, not a super creative name. Economists aren't creative. So all you have to do to figure that out is your marginal product multiplied by the price that they sell the good at. Those two things together get you your value of your marginal product. And that makes up the demand curve for a factor. But this is in a perfectly competitive market. And that's because marginal revenue and price are equal in a perfectly competitive product market. Now, how often does a perfectly competitive product market show up on the AP test versus a not perfectly competitive product market, and having to make that distinction? The answer is not frequently. Actually, I've never seen it on the test or heard of it being on the test. So what you should more focus on is the MRP. The MRP is the same basic idea, but it's just the idea that your MRP in perfectly competitive product markets when you flip that and figure out the MRP is equal to the VMP. However, for other market structures, you don't need the VMP at all. Instead, we use the marginal revenue product, which is the marginal revenue, which is still the price of the product, but it's, the price of the product no matter what, multiplied by the marginal product. So MRP is the demand curve for other factors. So in perfectly competitive product markets, it's VMP, which is equal to MRP as the demand for factors. But in everything, always MRP, which will always be correct, MRP is equal to the demand for different factors. So the MRP sub L, which is the marginal revenue product of labor, is the demand for labor in a factor market. Now, how do you cause this demand curve to shift? How do you cause the MRP or the VMP to shift? It's very basic. Two things make up the MRP or VMP: the price of the good and the marginal product. If either of those increase or decrease, then you have a shift of the curve. So if some new technology comes along that makes workers more productive, that increases the marginal product, that shifts your demand to the right. If the price of the product increases, that will increase the demand as well, because price increasing, price times MP, that moves the demand curve to the right. This is how derived demand works. If you have an increase in the demand for a good, then you have an increase in the price of that good, or an increase in the price of the good increases the MRP, which shifts it to the right. The only other thing that you have to think of is changes in supply of other factors causes a rightward shift of the MRP as well. And that's just has to do with supply chains making you more marginally productive. So that even fits in with this basic setup of MRP and marginal product increasing, therefore MRP increasing, because the increase in other factors of production increases the marginal product of the original factor. So, as a shortcut version, always think if it has to do with the marginal product or if it has to do with the price of the good, it will shift the curve. That's the basic way that I want you to think of this. Always just think of those two things. And that's it for a basic introduction to factor markets. We're going to be delving a little bit deeper into this in future lectures.